Hello, class. Here I am going to go a little bit more into depth and continue where we left off. And I know we already talked a lot about this on Monday, but I want to talk about the clan culture. Then, after the clan culture, get into the hierarchical, the adhocracy, and the market driven. I know we went over all those four quadrants. I just want to kind of put them in perspective. Clan cultures develop loyal employees. Why? Because they can pretty much do things that allow them autonomy to be creative and innovative. When you get into the hierarchical cultures often are formed in things that require very stringent type of protocol, like military, policing, fire, hospitals, that type of thing, and banks. Um, Oil, gas production, utilities, railroads. Um, it's important to monitor the behavior of individuals. Why? Especially with government, for compliance reasons. Then we get into the adhocracy culture. They really look at flexibility and discretion. Adhocracies usually lack the controls and norms of other organizations that are more in compliance. And they are able to better easily adapt to an ever changing marketplace, or what we used to talk about as the external environment. They're short lived because they change so quickly. Then you got the market driven cultures. Market driven cultures tend to flourish in consumer and industrial product areas where market shift and new markets emerge. This is right out of your book. Market driven cultures help organizations maintain internal controls. What does that really mean? What that means is a market driven culture is on the pulse of what's needed on the outside, what employers are doing to adapt to changes in that external environment. Apple did it, but Kodak didn't. They were the innovators of digital technology. But guess what? They decided they were going to stick to film. They didn't change. So the cell phone industry picked up on that. They changed. And ultimately, Kodak had to file for bankruptcy. Why? Because they were not market driven. They thought people had to go out and buy their products. Wayne Computer the same way. DEC, Digital Electronic Corporation, they did the same thing. They said people had to go out and buy our stuff, and they really didn't. Because people wanted different things out there. Steve Jobs always said, and I mentioned this in class so many times with you guys, he said, give people what they want, not what they need. So that's the market driven culture, keeping on top of the pulse of things. So next, I'm going to go into subcultures. And I talked about this in our introduction videos, but a subculture is a subculture to a dominant culture, an already existing culture. A subculture is part of the dominant culture, but it has a culture of its own. Here's an example. In your classes, all right, when I put you guys in teams, you remember that we had, say, 5 teams in a class, rather 6 teams with 5 members in each team. Well, each team was its own culture because you always had a lead person in the team and you worked together to put your case studies in order to present them properly. You needed to make those case studies, whether you use Google Books or whatever you use to work together, you found a way to put the culture together as a team. You put all of the teams together, you have a classroom culture. Well, subcultures work the same way. They're part of the existing culture, the overall arching culture, but they have their subcultures. Your book talks about Edgar Schein, Schein, and I mentioned this earlier, identified three, basically three subcultures in contemporary organizations. There were sorry about the voice, it's allergies. They were the operational subculture, the professional subculture, and the executive subculture. The operational subculture looks at local knowledge and skills for those that, obviously you need a certain skill set in a particular market in order to drive the company forward with its branding. And the operational culture really deals with problems that exist in the organization. Then you have the professional subculture, and they basically have to be pretty much by protocol. An operational culture focuses on technical knowledge that's transferable, that's needed in order to make the organization run smoothly. And usually these are hierarchical in nature. Professional cultures, attorneys, CPAs, physicians, engineers, all of those types of people. People who belong to and this is out of your book, a strong professional subculture, value autonomy and share similar values with other professionals who belong to their profession outside the organization. Just like what we're doing with the pandemic now. Doctors are working together in order to try to find solutions to problems. Then you have the executive subculture. And executive subcultures, these are individuals who are usually on top of the company's hierarchy. They share a concern over the, obviously, the strategic plan, the finances of the company. Without solid financing, the company can't run smoothly. Subcultures values control and accountability for those in the organization, and they want to make sure that others share the same goals and sub-goals. That's right out of your book. Okay, let's take a minute to reflect on this. Now we go to the national culture. And we want to differentiate between national and organizational cultures. And national culture, and I'm on page 438 of your book, affects people's behavior in the workplace. And it's another lens to understand how people identify with culture. National culture has to do with shared values, beliefs, but more importantly, those shared values and beliefs, this is what is to understand, are what creates the values of these individuals. And all of these values combined are transparent with one another to develop group norms. So individually, employees bring all of these values, beliefs, and behaviors to the workplace. Every time a new hire in a company comes through the door, the culture is somewhat changed, for the good or for the bad. Now, Gert Hofstede, he really looked deeply at international culture, and as we know, we're all globally connected, even with this pandemic, right? We all have to find ways to create models to try to do things differently, try to do things better than we did them before. So what Goethe did was he brought up a model that looks at different cultures in 5 fundamental dimensions. Look at figure 12.5 in your book. Give you a minute to look that over while I go get some water. Okay, so what Goethe stated was the 5 dimensions, and I mentioned these before, but want to go into a little bit more detail here. Power distance is the first. How much power is equally distributed among and across individuals. Now, the second one is individualism versus collectivism. Preference for working with others. And the second component is I versus we orientation. Do we work alone or do we work as a group? The next one, gender related, masculinity versus femininity. Preference for masculinity equals heroism, material rewards, and assertiveness. And that versus femininity, which equals cooperation, caring, and modesty. Well, since he did this, numbers have changed. And also, genders have been modified, recognizing that there are other types of individuals besides just categorically male and female. The next one is uncertainty avoidance, levels of comfort with ambiguity and certainty. And last is time orientation, orientation toward long-term or short-term time frames. So power distance really has to do with how much power the culture places on one group versus another. And a culture that has high power distance means that the culture accepts large differences between the most and the least powerful. So whether you're on the top of the totem pole or the bottom, you're listened to. And that's important. Because every individual, and I've said this several times before in class, has to know where their place is in the organization. They have to know where they stand, where they're involved. Individualism and collectivism, if the culture is high on individualism, it tends to focus on individual contribution, where collectivism is more dealing with the norms of the culture, close relationships, more clan-oriented that we talked about yesterday. We reward the group more than individuals. And there are strong loyalties to the group. And here again, it kind of makes sense because we talked about clan orientations usually being small or family-like businesses. So when we talked about HP, as big as they were, my gosh, they were a family-oriented culture for almost 100 years. That someone came in and tried to change it, it didn't work. And it cost them. It cost them a lot. Masculinity and femininity. So this talks about how cultures differ in gender roles and putting female genders into caring, modesty, and nurturing. That may be true in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways, society has changed. More women have emerged as leaders in higher echelons of organizations. It doesn't mean that they're less caring. It doesn't mean that they're more or less modest or nurturing. But it does mean that they have the ability to compete with males. Okay? And the idea is not competing in a bad way, but they share a lot of the traits that males now share, especially when it comes to um, work life balance. Males share a lot of orientations with females in work. Some women make more money than males in their professions, and the men stay home. But nurturing, caring, and modesty are traits that now are more shared. Also, gender related issues are looked at differently than they were maybe when Horstein came up with his 5 dimensions. So, research tells us we have to take a look at all of these things. Uncertainty avoidance. And this has to do with um, high uncertainty in a culture when there's a lack of clarity in rules. That's one of the things that clans are more accused of, uh, not having structure. And a lot of ambiguity comes out of uncertainty avoidance. But that doesn't mean that we don't have innovation. Look at Google, look at Apple, look at Microsoft, look at some of your bigger companies that really look at innovation as something that's very important. And time orientation, this degree to which a culture focuses on long term time orientation versus short term. Long term orientation looks at values, perseverance, future orientation. Okay, so that is the end now of phase 1.